Admiral, welcome back, and thanks to you and all the men and women you lead in Pacific Command. I want to talk today about relative strength of missile forces in the Indo-Pacific. Given the vast distances in that theater, missiles are a critical component of any country's security, including ours. How many of China's land-based missile forces do you estimate have a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers?
In an unclassified venue, Senator, over 90%. Over 90% fall in that range.
And how many missiles do you have that fall into that range?
I have none, sir.
You have none?
Right.
Why do you have none?
Because that range, 500 to 5,500 kilometers, is defined in the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which prohibits nuclear and cruise missiles and ICBMs, or nuclear and conventional cruise and ICBMs, or ballistic missiles in that range. And we adhere to the INF Treaty religiously, as we should. It's a treaty that we signed on for. China is not a signatory to the treaty, so they're not obliged to follow that treaty, and we can't legitimately, in my opinion, criticize China for developing weapons that contravene the treaty because they did not sign on to it.
Because the only two parties to the treaty are Russia and the United States.
That's correct. And there's some successor states from the Soviet Union that the treaty applies. But it's really us and Russia are the signatories to the treaty. General Selva just testified recently that Russia has violated the treaty in the conventional sense with a conventional cruise missile. And so at the end of the day, what you have is you have a treaty that binds theoretically two countries, one of which violates it without being held to account. The other adheres to it rigidly as it should. And then all the other countries in the world are not obliged to follow the treaty, and they don't. And those countries that are of concern, of course, are China and my region and Iran in Joe Hotels.
Well, since you mentioned General Selva's testimony, I think this is what you're referring to. He spoke to the House Armed Services Committee last month in which he said the Russians have deployed a land-based cruise missile that violates the spirit and intent of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and they do not intend to return to compliance. Is that what you're referring to?
It was, sir.
And you agree with that assessment?
I do.
And the INF Treaty was originally reached between the United States and the Soviet Union after the buildup of first Soviet forces in the late 70s and then our own forces along with NATO in 1983. And so it was geared primarily towards the European theater. Is that correct?
It was geared toward the Soviet Union, Senator, in a bipolar world. This was at the height of the Cold War, and now we're in a multipolar world where we have a lot of countries that are developing these weapons, including China, that I worry about. And I worry about their DF-21 and DF-26 missile programs, their anti-carrier ballistic missile programs, if you will. INF doesn't address missiles launched from ships or airplanes, but it focuses on those land-based systems. I think there's goodness in the INF Treaty. Anything you can do to limit nuclear weapons writ large is a general good, probably. But the aspects of the INF Treaty that limit our ability to counter Chinese and other countries' cruise missiles, land-based missiles, I think is problematic.
And as you say, since the United States and Russia are the only two parties to the treaty, and you and General Selva and several other U.S. government officials have said that Russia is violating the treaty, that means the United States is the only country in the world, that unilaterally refuses to build missiles that have a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers.
That is correct.
Do you think that we should consider renegotiating or withdrawing from the treaty or declaring Russia a material breach?
I would never advocate unilateral withdrawing from the treaty because of the nuclear limitation part of it. But I do think we should look at renegotiating the treaty. We should consider that because, as you say, there's only two countries that signed on to it, and one of them doesn't follow it, and so you know that becomes a unilateral limitation on us.
So one final question then. There's three scenarios. One is Russia comes back into compliance, the United States and Russia comply. Two is we somehow withdraw from or abrogate or declare Russia a material breach, so we are no longer unilaterally controlled. Or we continue the status quo, where we unilaterally are the only country that develops, that refuses to develop those missiles. Surely, whatever you think between 1 and 2, we can't accept 3 going forward, can we?
Right.
Thank you.
Thank